Thank you so much for the introduction, Oleksandr. And I really want to emphasize how grateful I am to be invited to have the opportunity here to speak to you about this book that is close to my heart. I spent a lot of time with it. So I'm very excited to talk about it. And I must say that your introduction here was very, very well founded, or I agree with you. Or what I've hoped is to connect, let's say, the particular discipline of urban planning and design using primarily spatial form to structure our cities, but to make also that discipline realize how it can relate, how it obviously relates to so many other disciplines and so many aspects of urban life. So I totally agree with you, but and in extension, maybe I also have a hope that other disciplines could take an interest in urban planning and design and see that it's a very important, more than one is doing today, see that it's a very important tool to steer both social and ecological processes in cities, maybe more than one is doing today then maybe. So I fully agree. I also agree, Alexander, that maybe when you start reading, there is may look like it's a very broad landscape opening, and maybe one may wonder where it's all heading. But I hope that in the end, that at least many of the pieces fall into place and so forth. And that is also kind of be an explanation to what this book is trying to achieve, because I think that we often in research today are forced into rather fragmented individual projects studying particular things, but we may less often have the opportunity to formalize this into larger theoretical frameworks. And having been part of research for a very long time in Sweden in the subjects of urban form and urban planning and urban design, I felt that a certain need to try to draw a lot of things that we had done through the years together in some kind of a larger framework. So that is the ambition with this book, and I'm very happy to talk to you about this. So the background is landscapes like this, and this is my second hometown, Gothenburg, where I am working, but actually I'm living in Stockholm. So I have both of these cities as are my primary objects. But this could be more or less any city, I guess. And I find this kind of landscape absolutely fascinating in that they are fundamentally they are natural landscapes, but where humans have worked with them, planned with them, built on them, rearranged them, reconfigured them in all kinds of ways, and often for very, very long time periods. Gothenburg is 400 years old, so it's not a very, very old city. But still, you can see all this human energy and efforts and knowledge and everything put into a landscape like this, and trying to adjust it to the way different ways of living and so forth for humans primarily. But also, I mean, this is a very, very heavy and very difficult to change structure. So today, with facing new challenges in cities, we can also see how this huge landscape is currently directing things maybe in directions that we are not aiming for anymore. I mean, this is a typical image of an 20th century industrial city. We see all the big industrial plants, we see all of the big highways and so forth. We also see a typical kind of housing neighborhood structure and so forth, where we today see, not least in Gothenburg actually, a huge problems with these, and the huge aim is to try to redirect this into another direction of a more sustainable society, both socially and environmentally. And in doing that, this is kind of still working in a different direction. I mean, it's still promoting a lot of car traffic. It's still an industrial city when Gothenburg wants to become a knowledge city. We have the many isolated housing areas where we now are aiming to integrate these to build social cohesion and all these kind of ambitions that we have. But the whole landscape is kind of working in a different direction. But of course, this huge investment is also, not least, representing a huge value. And value in a broad sense. And this is where the idea of spatial capital comes in. Value in a broad sense. Of course, it creates a certain use value. It kind of supports everything that's taking place in a city. Our everyday lives and the large process, economic and social, and not least ecological, to a certain degree. So it's doing some rather important and heavy labor every day, and in that sense supporting what's going on in the city. But of course, in extension of that, it also represents a huge economic value. As a matter of fact, the global wealth is to 2/3 real estate values. So the value of land and the buildings on land and the land improvements of we also find are the absolutely majority
Хочу
of
послухати
global wealth.
кол про.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
just unmuted. Yeah.
No, no
Sorry.
problem. Okay, let's carry on. So it's also representing a huge value, both as a use value, but also in real estate value. So this has led me to thinking of cities and the built environment and the physical environment that they represent as a capital. And then we need to go back to, because to be precise what one means by capital and what I mean with it in this book. Capital is, of course, one of the major production factors in classical economics, and still is, of course. So we have labor, we have capital, and we have land. And all of these are necessary for any kind of production and are absolutely fundamental. Land, however, often it kind of emerges in two forms. On the one hand, land as natural resources, that can be just anything that we find in land. It can be oil, it can be, timber or whatever, fish in the ocean and so forth. Natural resources of all kinds. But land is also, of course, also pure spatial expansion or extension. The thing that we need to do most anything as humans, we have to produce or we have to live somewhere and we need land for that. But of course, these two things are very, very different things. So when I speak of land here, I will emphasize land as spatial extension and much less land as natural resources. But also capital comes in many forms. And this is where, we often maybe also confuse. It's such a broad concept. It comes up in all kinds of, and there's so many types of capital these days. So maybe it's not such a good idea to try to introduce another one. But I think it can be useful. But to divide the capital concept in at least two major forms, we have on the one hand capital as accumulated value, most often, known as money, or we meet it as money. And that's normally what we normally, or usually what we talk about when we talk about capital. But in an older sense, capital also is what was called embodied labor. So the other side of capital is all types of technology, really, machines and tools of all kinds. And I really like this idea of embodied labor. It kind of means just certain parts of human labor are used to create tools and machines that alleviate future labor, makes it easier in the future, makes us more productive in the future by using these tools and machines. And of course, again, it's primarily in this second sense that I talk about spatial capital as embodied labor, but on a huge scale. All the built fabric, the whole physical dimension of our cities represents a capital, a kind of embodied labor that accelerates and enhances future labor, or enhances simply our everyday lives in cities, or larger processes like different markets, clusters, or social cohesion, or all of these big topics. So trying to sort things, when I speak about land, I primarily speak about land as spatial extension. And when I speak about capital, I primarily speak about this as embodied labor. But also embodied labor comes in many forms. Now it's I'm confusing here, but you can see it. The typical things are tools and machines, but also buildings actually is normally referred to as a form of capital in the sense of embodied labor, and also infrastructure such as roads and railroads and all kinds of things like that is also referred to as capital in the sense of embodied labor. And then we realized that buildings and infrastructure is very closely related to land, of course. They are all kind of tied to land. And this is what I mean by spatial capital. That is capital tied to land. It's a particular form of capital that is highly related to land and often tied to land. But the background with this confusion of these concepts, I would argue, is a reason that we don't really see how important this form of capital, the spatial capital, is. And maybe it's even not even recognized when within the discipline of urban planning and design, which so forcefully works with this materia, so to speak, and creates and structures and shapes spatial capital. So this is the reason I want to lift it out and give it a kind of proper economic framework to emphasize its key role, both within the discipline of urban planning and design, but hopefully also making it interesting for other disciplines. Now, if we move to spatial form as also a form of value, I have already argued how it creates both the use value and real estate value. And I don't know if this is the best image of use value, but often we talk about in urban planning and design that we want to create places that are used and also attractive for, everyday life in cities. So, but it's not just a thing that we maybe appreciate and find attractive to spend time together. We could also realize that this somehow is also a situation of building, hopefully at least, social cohesion in society. And it's also a very small marketplace, even though it's maybe not economically that important. It kind of represents both a market and a sense of public sphere where people meet and build social cohesion, but it's also a meeting place for everyday life. And this is what we aim for in urban planning and design, of course. So primarily we talk about use values like this, creating the potential for these things to happen in an attractive way. But of course, it also creates, as I've been touching on, real estate values, monetary values of different kinds. So there's both of these things are there also when we talk about spatial capital as a value. Now, it's important to emphasize, though, that when we talk about real estate values, and I will emphasize this a little bit more because maybe it's less often discussed, at least from the point of view of urban planning and design, that it is made up of two things. Really, a real estate value is made up, on the one hand, of land itself, and that is primarily location. Where are things? Where is the piece of land located? On the other hand, it's made up of land improvements, how we improve a certain piece of land, most often by buildings, but it can, of course, be other things such as landscaping or other kind of improvements of land. So I think this is important. The real estate value on the one hand is if we simplify, the building on the piece of land. And on the other hand, it's the land in itself. And the value of land in itself is very, very much location. We've all heard of that. What is the value of land? Well, there are three things, right? Location, location, and location. So obviously, if the same building is located in different locations in a city or in different cities, the value of that building will be very different, or the land with that building will be very different. So location obviously is very, very important here. So if we want to start to measure the value of land, the title of the book is Measures and Meanings. So I will start with the measures and I'll try to get to the meanings also later on. So if we start with the measures, we can see that there are two things here. On the one hand, we have land values, and that is has very much to do with location, as I said. And what creates location in cities? Well, street networks primarily. It creates accessibility between each and every place, each and every address, each and every building to every other place, address, or building in the city. Due to its particular configuration or shape and form, it creates a certain pattern of accessibility, which in extension creates location. So on the one hand, if we want to measure this, we need to look at street networks. On the other hand, as I've already emphasized, if we want to look at the land improvements, we have to look at the buildings, because the buildings increase the value of land by creating more floor space in a particular location. So we have two dimensions here. So if we want to measure these, we need to look on the one hand at street networks and on the other hand on buildings. And I will start with the street networks. And location is a very difficult thing, actually, to try to be very precise about. I think we often primarily think about it as, different amenities or services found in particular locations. And these are, of course, very important. But I will instead or more emphasize the accessibility to these services or amenities in different locations created by the street network. And if we imagine a very simplified city to the right here, we realize with a few streets and a few neighborhoods, and they are connected in a particular way, as this configuration shows, we realize that certain locations will be more accessible than others, measured especially if we look from each and every location to each and every other location. So even though we would build the same neighborhood in all of these locations, when people start to move through the city in everyday life, I hope that you get the feeling that, but these different locations will in the end be very different. The more peripheral ones will have a different character than the ones in the center, where more people are likely to pass all the time. So over time, even though they are similar, they may be changing into very different types of neighborhoods. Putting it a bit differently, the street network creates very different potentials for the different locations of these neighborhoods. And over time, that will have a huge impact on these neighborhoods. And actually, there's a very simple way of measuring this called centrality. All of this is taken actually from network analysis, which is very used in so many disciplines around, but it can also be used when we look at city. If we exactly are looking for the relation between different locations, or opposite, how the configuration of different places create location at these different places, or different character of the locations. So actually, centrality is a simple distance measurement where we normally measure the distance from A to B, which is what we regularly used to. But centrality is a bit different from that, and it instead measures the mean distance from A to all other places. And I think when one starts to think of that, I think one can feel rather clearly how that, that kind of captures something that we could call centrality. How central is this location in relation to all other locations? And we also realized that if we would continue and measure this from all of these locations, they would have very different centrality. The mean distance from the peripheral ones to all of the other locations is of course larger than the mean distance from the central locations. So we can measure this using this very particular type of measurement borrowed from network analysis. And this is something that's been done for a long time in a particular research direction called space syntax, developed at UCL in London since the 70s, 80s, and so forth. That has been very, very important for the work we've been doing in our research, both at KTH in Stockholm and at Chalmers in Gothenburg. The map to the right here, in the colorful map, actually is a centrality analysis of all the streets in an urban area. So the red here, the red color, means that the centrality of these streets is very high. That means that it's close, so to speak, to all of the mean distance to all of the other streets in the city is very low, whereas the green and blue ones are very high, so that the distance is very high. The centrality is low. The fascinating thing, there are many things here. I don't have the time now to go exactly into how this is measured. It's not very strange. It's kind of a topological measurement where you measure how many other streets you have to pass to move from one street to another one. But there are certain other things that would be interesting to talk some other time on how it's measured. But what I will emphasize now is that what you see here is not a simple kind of center to periphery pattern, but rather a much more structured pattern of how this centrality is distributed in the city. But more interesting than that is also that this analysis correlates highly with how people actually move in the city. So that the streets with a high centrality have a very much more pedestrian movement and also to some degree car movement than the streets that are green and blue. So what we find here is that with a rather simple analysis of a street pattern using the centrality measure, we find we seem to be capture some kind of potential in the street network that correlates quite strongly with how people actually move. So we make a connection between the physical world, the built environment, and the actually lived environment, or how people behave and use the city. Because an extension of this is, of course, that even though, yes, some people move more people in the more centrally located streets than in the more not so central. But that means also that we are likely to find more retail or more restaurants at certain streets than at others. And an extension of that, maybe even also higher prices for renting floor space than in other locations. So we get a connection from a purely physical description of the morphology of the city, correlating with people and how they move. And in extension of that, we can go into land use distributions, and in the next step, the economics of land use and so forth. So this is a very, very fundamental and very, very useful link created between the physical environment and the actually lived environment. So here we have a rather simple way of measuring, describing street networks, where we could see that on a very fundamental level, the space, the morphology and the structure and shape of the street system actually distributes how people use this space, but in extension, it also is likely to influence the value of land. The more centrally located locations are likely to both give rise to higher prices when it comes to letting floor space, but also for land prices. Of course, it's not an absolute correlation or or so, but there are strong patterns between this. So we see that the street network here can be very useful if you want to measure the street network and thereby location and extension, potentially the value of location in cities. Now going back, so we have talked now about street networks. We can also talk about buildings, land improvements, the other dimension of the value of land and spatial capital. And densities and the buildings is often measured using different density measures. And density is, of course, the most common way of describing or measuring cities there is. I mean, that's what we talk about all the time. But it's also rather confusing. It's not necessarily capturing what we're looking for. It's a rather crude measurement often, and fundamentally it's about, normally it's called an exploitation ratio. That is, how much will land be exploited for new building and so forth. So it's not a very qualitative, it doesn't really capture well different types of ways of building in cities. For instance, these three images have all the same density, 75 housing units per hectare. So it's not really capturing a lot of the quality of the cities. So we've been working on this, and this is more of a contribution actually from within our research at Chalmers and KTH. If this could be improved, not least given the rather exciting results one finds from these space syntax analysis. So what we've done is that we have loaded a typical space syntax analysis where you find a street system to the right here with certain contents. For instance, the floor space. So what you see to the left here is simple, another one of this description of the density of floor space, but in a rather high resolution map where each and every plot or parcel, the density of each plot and parcel is represented in a regular way of how density normally is represented. But using the axial map, which is the representation of the street network used in space syntax analysis, to instead create the accessibility to floor space. So both of these images have the same data on floor space, but to the left it's measured as the density, the building density of each and every plot and parcel in this area, whereas it to the right is measured as the accessibility to floor space from each and every plot and parcel, and furthermore within a certain radius, in this case 800 meters or a typical 10-minute walk. So it's the same data, but it's represented differently. It's analyzed and then represented differently. And of course, we give rise to very different images. Both can be useful, but from the point of view of creating value, we understand the right one to be even more important when it comes to land improvements and because it also captures what your neighbors are doing and so forth. So you get that kind of thing into your measurement here. And this is something we call place syntax analysis in parentheses, an extension to the space syntax analysis, which is simply loading or weighing space syntax analysis with any kind of data that you have. It could also be, retail, it could be population, it could be parks, it could be bus stops, whatever. And instead of just representing them in a map, we can create images of the accessibility to these things. And furthermore, we can do it using different radii, depending on what you're looking for. But that was just a parenthesis. So this is kind of methodological development, the place syntax analysis, a methodological development to space syntax analysis. So together now we can represent both of these in an image like this one. This is from central Gothenburg. On the one hand, with the street network, which create location, I have argued. And the other hand, it's building density of floor space, buildings density of floor space. So what you see now in the brown to yellow street network is the centrality of each and every street segment analyzed or measured in the way that I've been saying, as centrality. So it represents the centrality in the street network for each and every street segment. And in the blue, you see the accessibility to floor space, in this case, calculated for each and every plot and parcel within a certain radius. I think in this case, it's 500 meters, not 800 meters. So together, they kind of create a very strong description of these two fundamental dimensions of, the value of space, urban space or urban land. Both in a kind of a use value perspective, because we can start to realize that different places have different potentials for urban life, for the location of retail, for gathering people in public space, and all of these things. But it also visualizes how this is further enhanced by land improvements of buildings, where you in certain locations are close to a lot of floor space, whereas in other locations you are not. Just to emphasize that there are some kind of empirical support, and rather forceful support actually, for the correlation between these analyses that I'm presenting and human pedestrian movement. I just briefly will just present a little bit from a very large empirical study of 3 cities, London, Amsterdam, and Stockholm, where we measured pedestrian movement in different locations in all of these 3 cities using anonymous mobile phone signals. So it was very large. So it was 3 cities, and it was in altogether like 20 or 20, more than 20 areas in all 3 cities. And furthermore, maybe 20 to 25 locations within each area. So it's a very, very large study, actually. And all of these areas were very different. And it also represented more or less all, it's not just the central part of cities, it's also in the very peripheral parts of the city, so forth. Just to illustrate the rather close correlation we find here, when we did this for all of these three cities, in all of these areas and in all of these locations, we had a correlation value of 0.65 for generally all over this case, all these 3 cases, saying that to, let's say, 65%, we could potentially, this is overestimating, but in principle, predict the presence of people moving in certain locations to 65% only using the centrality measure. So it's quite a strong one. I could go into lots of details on this study, but it's here more just presenting that there are studies showing the relation here between these locations created by spatial form and actual human movement in these locations. Anyway, so in the end, I want to say that when it comes to measures of spatial capital, we can see a landscape where we, on the one hand, have the centrality of streets, and on the other hand, the accessibility to floor space. So that is what you see in this case, which is a more recent image. It's from London, showing in red then the different, the centrality of each and every street segment in different nuances of red. And in gray, you could find the accessibility to floor space, as you can see it in the background. So it's quite fine scale, a very high resolution analysis. And of course, we don't have an absolute correlation here, how people move, and correlation even less to the value of land. But it is a very fundamental piece of the puzzle, and a large piece of the puzzle. So this is what we try to develop when it comes to measuring urban space, the configuration of space in cities, and an extension of land, of course. Now, I don't know. You, Alexander, you tell me if I'm talking too long. But I would like to try to push it also into the what I call the meanings of spatial capital, even though it will not be as long as this one. So please tell me if I'm talking too much. But of course, if we can start to describe the landscape, the physical built landscape, the spatial capital, so to speak, of different cities, it's of course exciting to relate it to different urban processes, urban systems of more social and economic kinds. And this is, of course, the whole point of doing these analyses and try to how, for instance, the configuration of space in cities relate to different social systems. And we've done quite a lot of studies when it comes to social segregation in Swedish cities. Increasingly, we're looking into also trying to capture ecosystems in cities, but of course that raises a lot of new questions and so forth. But we're trying to push on that too, how the spatial capital, the spatial form of cities also structures and directs ecosystems, or more often maybe hindrances for ecosystems to function in cities. Of course, if we could understand that better, we could also include ecosystems in urban planning and design, and how we could enhance and support that in different ways. But there's more, it's a different kind of question and so forth, but still, in principle, this is what we're pushing. And also, of course, markets in cities, economic markets, market locations, it's of course fundamental in cities. And you have markets of all kinds of shapes and sizes in cities and so forth. And how does the spatial form, the spatial capital support that, or maybe also create hindrances for such market to be sustainable over time. So here we can start to address all of these big issues. And I've tried to illustrate what I mean a little bit with these, going into detail of different locations. Keeping in mind, again, this very simple representation in the middle here of a very simplified cities and different locations within that city. And then to the right, you have the center of Gothenburg and what could be represented, what could be more lifelike examples of these different locations. So in the middle here, we see the most central location in the city. In this case, we move to Gothenburg and say the most central location you find where the large orange ring is. And to the left, you have a photograph of that location, which is a very nice place actually, where you meet a lot of people. And typically we here can find support for our theory. And here at this location called Brunnsparken, you find more people present than in any other location in Gothenburg, more or less at least. So maybe you have 5,000 people passing here when it's at peak hours per hour. So you have 5,000 people passing, and this is quite an exciting and rather fantastic phenomenon, because nowhere else do you see as many people from the city of Gothenburg on a regular basis, not when it's a particular event or something, or every day it kind of happens, gathered together. And of course that in certain senses create a certain sense of publicness, you have an opportunity here to meet more people in Gothenburg, or at least share the space with more people in Gothenburg than any other place, and actually creates an opportunity to realize that Gothenburg is quite a big city, which is actually rather difficult to find out in other locations in the city. But in this place, you start to find, yes, this is pretty big. And it's not just that there's a lot of people. You sense also that these people come from very large parts of the city. It's not local people. They come from all over the place. And they all, for a moment, share this space. And I think this is very exciting, because it creates, for a moment, a public sphere of a certain size where people can maybe not interact, it's not likely, but they may recognize and become aware of each other, and for a moment share this space together. In economic terms, it's of course also it's rather a market, or a market support for different retail in this case. So you find here is very large market that you find kind of McDonald's, all the big brands. You don't find small shops because it's too expensive for them to be here. You find the big brands. So it creates a very particular market situation. Again, due to the presence of so many people. And of course, in extension, I would argue that these many people gather here because it has this very central location. So in my interpretation, the people come here due to the location in the largest system of the city, the largest spatial system of the city. They don't come here because you here have the large retail stores. The retail stores has come here because the people are here in this central location. Of course, there's some interaction in both ways here, but I would argue and emphasize this other aspect, that it's the central location created by the spatial network, the spatial capital, so to speak, that creates this unique marketplace, but also this public space, which is unique for Gothenburg. If we now move a little bit to the side of this very central location, I mean, this is still in a very central part of the city. We come to a much less populated or less used part of the city. Still, there's a lot of people moving in streets and so forth, but we have moved now from the big city of Gothenburg to kind of a small time version of the same city. And it creates a very different public space, a different sense of meeting other people. It's more local. People may even live in this area. Maybe they even know each other. Maybe they say hi to each other because this is a much more local situation. It creates a very different public sphere than the earlier place did. And maybe it's just more, well, it's more like 500 persons per hour that pass here. In a market perspective, in an economic perspective, this is of course a much smaller market, and you don't find McDonald's and the big brands anymore, but rather small and self-owned shops. It creates a very different market. Again, I would argue it's depending on the location and the amount of people that are likely to pass here and create this market. So finally, we moved to one of these new areas built in maybe 20 years ago, kind of more peripheral. It has all the attractions. It has the view of the sea. It has some industrial memories. It has rather high-class public space, a lot of investments and so forth. But still, you don't have very many people moving here. Maybe it's 50 persons per hour. And now we are really in a kind of more of a neighborhood situation. The people moving here, maybe meeting each other, are likely to be from this part of the city. They're living here and so forth. Economically, it's a much smaller market. You don't find many shops. There's not much retail. Maybe there's takeaway sushi restaurant or something like that, but not much more and so forth. So in the end, my point, I think, is becoming clear that the spatial capital, the spatial form of the city, creates locations of very, very different potential, both socially and economically. I'm not saying that one is good and the other is bad, but we have to realize that it's very different. And from an urban planning and design point of view, it's important to realize what we're aiming for, and maybe even more important, what we actually can achieve in different locations. So this is just describing how this varies, and this is just 3 locations when there is, of course, thousands of different locations in a city like Gothenburg, and all of them, in a sense, a little bit different from each other. And the power of a city is, of course, to have all of these kind of different locations, because you don't just want one ideal position, you want to have all of these present. In parentheses said, maybe some of them are also not that good. I mean, maybe are problematic planning mistakes and so forth. But generally speaking, you could see that there's a range of different locations here. And finally, trying to draw these together is that just to emphasize that this is not small things, because the co-presence of people like this, the movement of people creating co-presence, is absolutely essential to some of the more, many of other disciplines. And maybe now there are people in the audience that know things about this much better than I do. But I found it very, very interesting to read, for instance, Émile Durkheim, more or less the founder of modern sociology, and how he emphasizes the need to understand what he calls the social morphology if we are to understand social phenomena. And with that, he actually means exactly the density of people, the accessibility between people, and the concentrations of people, and how this influences in a deep sense, different sociological phenomena. And also how not least, the co-presence of people is absolutely essential in his argument when it comes to creating social cohesion. This is and there's a long there's several other sociologists following in the tradition of Durkheim emphasizing this. Most famously, for instance, Erving Goffman in the 50s and 60s that wrote a lot about the essential value of co-presence in keeping society together and so forth. One could elaborate a lot on this. I will not do that. I will try briefly also to touch on the economics, because in a similar sense, it's obvious that when you talk about economics, or urban economics at least, again, co-presence and the closeness of people, the high accessibility of people, the concentration of people, is what creates what is known as the agglomeration effects typical for cities. This is something first noticed by Alfred Marshall, the economist that was first in observing cities and the particular properties of cities when it comes to economic activity of different kinds. And he said as these agglomeration effects, you're so close to many things. This closeness of people creates thick labor markets. You have a lot of labor close to you if you want to hire people. You have large input markets. You have access to different things you may need in your production. You have also, of course, large output markets, people that may be wanting to buy what you produce. And finally, you have unique knowledge markets where you have people around you knowing a lot of things. And this is also when certain cities have certain profiles. You have let's for instance, speak of Silicon Valley. You have a lot of knowledge close to you that are of high relevance to yourself. So you can kind of overhear where things are going and so forth. Anyway, summarizing, the closeness of people, the accessibility to people is absolutely essential in the understanding of urban economics. And again, I would then argue that these kind of maps capture quite a bit of that potential, and not only saying that it's present in cities, but also how it's distributed throughout cities so that different locations may have more or less of these qualities and so forth. And in that sense, the argument again is that by describing the built form of the city in this way, the spatial form of the city, we also can argue that capturing a spatial capital that produces different potentials in different locations, supporting all these things, everything from everyday life into particular sociological phenomena to economical phenomena. So that's the basic argument of the whole thing. And I think I stop there. I think I've talked very long for already, and to give us some chance for some questions and so forth, or comments and maybe critical comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lars, for the first or the major part of this story. Now, as you've put it and explained to us, well, I have several things I think I can start the discussion with. And well, I guess people can also think about maybe they have some sort of follow-up questions or kind of comments coming from their background. Well, one of the things I think is, let's say, the part of the conceptual or epistemological issue is why are we in such trouble defining space and land? I mean, for the level of the advancement of the civilization, let's say, it seems a bit paradoxical that we are on a, let's say, an international, national, local level, has been so much a trouble being able to define and work with the issue of urban space, or kind of, as you mentioned, it is a material space defined by networks. Why is that?
Yep, it's of course a good question, but probably a very large question. But very broadly, I think often when we try to translate things into space, kind of grounded in particular locations and so forth, whatever we're talking about, it often creates a problem. In a very basic sense, spatial statistics is super difficult in comparison to regular statistics, because the closeness to other things disturbs the whole analysis and so on. And this is what happens all the time. So I think there is something fundamentally that I don't really I cannot really elaborate in detail. I don't know enough, but there is some problem there. But I also think that there is a kind of a paradigmatic change that we could go through many sciences, including urban planning and design, or different disciplines, where not least in urban planning and design, and urban morphology, which would be then the study of urban form, one has been very focused on kind of different objects, different, you have this housing estate, you have this building, you have this street, you have this square, you have but you have not put it really in a systems relation. And that, I think, is a fundamental change that I think has taken place in many disciplines. Of course, not recently, for a long time, but if you go back, and I think maybe in urban design and urban morphology and so forth, one has been extra slow in making that transition. So I think, I mean, you could go back to you can go back to Jane Jacobs and her fundamental critique when she says that as I find the most the roughest part of her critique is when she's saying, why haven't the people responsible for the development of our cities realized what kind of problem they have, or something like that. And then she goes on and say, cities is a problem of organized complexity. And she's probably the first one to point out that cities are cities of complexity. And I don't think that planners or urban morphologists, not then and then not for a long time, thought of cities in that way. And to start to at all unpack the idea of the complexity of a city, you have to look at it as a system. And I think that has been very slow in coming in the discipline that I know of. Of course, there's and so forth, or closest to where I am, urban design, urban morphology.
Right.
It's a big question. Trying to answer.
Yeah, that was a very good answer from my side. I think it showed like a lot of hints about where to look further for kind of some next steps. So another point I have for you right now is that while reading, I saw, let's say, one of the things that let's maybe divide the discussion into two parts. Let's say one is about economics of land, and the other is cities as systems, because I think both of them kind of are pertinent to what I was trying to see in your work. And from the kind of a side of economics of land, you've been quoting Ryan Collins a lot during some of the chapters, which is, in a sense, let's say not a revolution, but let's say a turn in economics to space, or kind of an attempt to land economics on land, and show to a lot of economists that where the wealth comes from, and that a lot of things have been, let's say, forgotten or misunderstood or treated disregarding the specifics of land markets, which are always imperfect, which are always working in the way that is not the way that microeconomics expect them to work. And you mentioned Georgism, and you discussed the idea that land and land rent is in our society, but you didn't mention it in presentation. What is maybe your short, let's say, take on this problem, both as a theoretical component and as a, let's say, practical or maybe policy answer to what should be done about it?
No, yes, I've left out a lot here, and I'm very happy that you raised this, because that's kind of where it ends with this old idea of Henry George, and Henry George is not. First of all, I'm not an economist, so I'm trying to play games that others are playing much better than I. But I have come to realize that urban planning and design and this description of the urban form of cities represents huge economic values of all kinds. So that's why I've become interested in it. And then, of course, we're all working in this sustainability aim, try to develop that and understand that. And then it came when I came across the ideas of Henry George, which is, of course, yes. It became very apparent to me. And actually, this is where I stopped. I can maybe show a few more images, just not a long thing, but just to show that what is pointed out here, what I did earlier say that the value of land improvements, that's primarily a real estate value is contributed value of land improvements and value of land. And we could simplify that into buildings and locations. And streets, networks create location, and buildings, of course, create floor space. But the interesting thing here, which is pointed out by Henry George, is the next thing here, that who is creating this value? Well, the value of land improvements, of course, the landowner can take care of that and build new buildings on his land and thereby influence that very much. But he or she cannot influence the location, right? So what is influencing the location? Well, it's actually public planning. And it's also often public investments, for instance, in new schools or new tramways or in parks. And all of this is received by the individual landowner. So there's a very large part of the real estate value that actually is created outside the piece of land owned by a landowner, a very large part. And actually it increases. This is the large image. I should not, I will not extend this. The larger the city is, the larger part of the real estate value is created by location, and less of it is the building. So in a large city like Stockholm, it can be like 60 to 70% of the real estate value is location, and only 30 to 40 is the building, how much is invested in the buildings. In Gothenburg, it's a little less, and in a very small town, of course, it's much less. So it's only like 10 or 20% that's location. And this is rather simple. It's like in the countryside, of course, there's a lot of land but very few buildings. On Manhattan, there's very little land and very much buildings. So the value increases in the land in that kind of. And anyway, so that creates that a lot of these values are created outside of the individual landowner, but over time the land value tends to increase. And here's an opportunity then. This is Henry George's argument that we should tax this increase in land value, and we could create a tax switch from tax on labor, which is becoming very expensive, to tax on land. And in extension, that would also mean that it has a lot of sustainability issues, both environmental and socially. I shouldn't go too far, but that's his idea. And suddenly I realized, oh, we're describing this. We are able to measure this, which often has been very difficult when you come to this Henry George argument, that you cannot really, as you were saying, Oleksandr, measure things. It's difficult to be precise on these things, but maybe we can. And that's when I found the Henry George argument very exciting. There's much more to it. I'm confusing here, talking too many things. But okay. I hope that was useful.
Yeah, I mean, this point, which arrives quite late in the book, I think is a very let's say hard to swallow for a lot of people. But I think it also can be tied to different issues regarding if we understand the economics of land, then it comes as a simple answer. If we actually kind of dive into how value of real estate is created, then taxing the value of
Exactly.
land doesn't come out as a surprise because it has nothing to do with the landowner and his or her interests, but it has to do with the public investment and the quality of life and other types of taxation that has been fueling the rise of property. One of the last things that I wanted to, before I give a floor to questions, I see Maria has her hands up, is about understanding of the putting the heuristic understanding towards the practical understanding. How do planners and urban designers in their work can resolve this, what do you call a normative challenge of transferring from our, let's say, linear economy, from our extensive land use models towards social, ecological cities? What are the learnings that we can take from your understanding of land and spatial capital to resolve this challenge of transition?
Yes, I think it's if I would try to be a little bit shorter now in my answers, I think these kind of descriptions that I show, like the image we should see here, I think makes it possible to illustrate the kind of systems character of urban space, so that you can work with it also as an urban planner and urban designer, which otherwise is very difficult to do because you don't really see the system and you cannot really follow the system's effects of what you do. Because if you have a map like this, or a model, a digital model, which this is, you could of course go in, get into this and start to change things in new planning projects, and you could see the effects of these new planning projects, and thereby also realizing that you're creating things and changing things beyond your own project, so to speak. Which changes, I think, the whole approach in planning, which is normally you just find an empty space and you do something there, a new kind of housing estate or something. But here you can see that when doing that, you're also creating changes far away from that by making new connections or hindering certain connections and so forth. So you need to start to work as a planner in a very different way and actually work with the whole system, which is very rarely done today, at least in a Swedish context. It's always, you run down to your little local project and you try to do your best, but a lot of the qualities that you actually want to create in that local projects demands changes maybe in other locations, and so forth. That's fundamentally. And now you can visualize that and you can actually work with it interactively. And we developed some softwares that make that possible also in a simple way. This is a GIS plugin that has done this image, but we have much more simple tools that you could use for, regular design work, where you momentatious, um, very quickly can model what you're doing. Yes.
Okay.
So that changes it, but there's lots of other things to your question, but to keep it short.
Yeah, thank you. Let's open the floor to questions from the audience then. I see Maria who has something to ask, so please start.
Hello. First
Hello.
of all, I want to thank you for your really interesting presentation. I'm sorry I haven't read your book yet, but I will. I first decided to hear your presentation like as a spoiler, and then decided to read the book, and I'm already excited to read it. And how I understand, your research is like a proof, I would say, for me, about what is actually trigger the extension of the space in our urban territories. And I really like how you said about the developers, and I'm sorry, how you say about developers that they are like and you also show this example that commercial territories, they come in and try to expand the space because there already exists a group of people that really like to visit this space, and that's why this space became more dense. And for me, it's like point that if we overlap it with the social inequality and, for example, salaries of the cities, we can make conclusions that in the city could be social injustice or low accessibility, or some group of people can't have the possibility to live in the super dense and central areas. And what I'm started to interest in more closer, it's when you started to talk about ecosystem services, that it's more triggers more new questions than answers. And I talked recently with one of my friends, and we discussed that if we try to maybe obligate some group of people who live super close to nature spaces like rivers or maybe forest, and tax them, so make the price for their land more higher, maybe somehow it will provide us with more money to make and develop areas that are lacking with the green spaces or other nature resources, somehow to balance this social injustice. Because it looks like in our Ukrainian cities, how I see, everything is happening like a little bit opposite than in European cities, because in our cities, some commercial developers, they are looking on nature objects as a barrier that should be or destroyed or put in underground, and not somehow show to make it as a capital that should bring more value price to the land, something like this. So you really inspire me to read your book more deeper. So thank you. Yeah, that I have like not more the question, more like a comment. Yes, and also I would say your research and this your presentation show me and preview for the answer why former industrial territories are developing super slow, because no one wants to visit these places. They abandon it, and commercial developers look like, oh, why we need to invest in this land? No one wants to use it. So, and that is look like that in our Ukrainian cities, how we see that these former industrial territories, they are neglected, and developers try to develop that part of land that's already super dense and create more pressure on infrastructure, also like on the road network, because then we receive traffic jams, overcrowded public transportation, and lack of investments in the outskirts territories.
Thank you. That was very kind words. Thank you. That's very nice. First, a general thing. The book is now available. I'll send a link to Oleksandr. It's available to open access. So one can go to MIT and then you just download and so. If you don't want to buy it, just good to know. So I will send that link, and then there were many things, but just briefly on the green structure and so forth. I think that's I think that's something that's the major change, I think, of cities in the future, that we need to deal much more with the green structure of cities. And actually, I think that it doesn't need to be that it depends, but it doesn't. It can be integrated with the urban fabric, because to my mind, it's not really a necessary choice between either a green and dispersed city or the dense and vibrant city. I think these can be combined. Again, it's the magic of space that different things can happen at the same time in different locations, although very close to each other. So you can have, I mean, normally when you walk, take London, you walk around, there's certain dense areas, and suddenly it's not dense, suddenly it's very intense urban life, and suddenly it's not. And it's just a few hundred meters between them, or even less than 100 meters. So things are differently. So you can integrate a lot more green, and a lot more in public spaces, including streets, could be much more green and actually support ecosystems. This is another thing. We are working on another book that we call social ecological urbanism, where we work with ecologists, urban ecologists, and so forth, and how this can be combined. So I agree with you so much that there's so much quality and health issues and all kinds of things related to the green in cities. So it's a very important thing for the future. And then, of course, when you say, finally, when you talk about also current developments, and that's true for Sweden too, I mean, it's often very short-sighted, and one tries to maximize and optimize each and every piece of land, so to speak, to make the most of it in economic terms. Where I think these kind of images that I'm showing here is showing how, first of all, how important planning is in creating value in the built fabric, or in even real estate. On the other hand, that you can distribute location, or good location, so to speak, throughout the city. And again, London is a pretty good example, because it has this continuous landscape where you find very, so to speak, good locations, also in economic terms, quite far away in the periphery. It's not a very hierarchical city, it's a distributed city. And it's very much due to its planning, where you have this continuous street network that is not much disrupted. In many other cities, you have all these kind of disruptions, and then suddenly the center becomes overheated, and the periphery becomes, So from that point of view, again, conscious planning can be very useful and very important. But thank you very much, Maria. Those nice questions.
Yeah, we have a raised hand from Todor. Please take your stage.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the event. Big fan, by the way, Lars, to you and your research group. I'm based in Norway, so I kind of understand some of the context. But actually, I wanted to ask a question. Maria touched upon that a little bit, but I want to bring it back to the methodological terms. So, of course, I think speculative planning happens all around the place, and it's very hard. But that goes outside of the area of what we're trying to do here, how we measure space, right? And I think your concept of spatial capital, I mean, it's not something that I have followed your work, so I know like a lot of the things that is happening there, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it makes a lot of sense from the correlation with values, real estate values, and so on. But actually, I wanted to, and something that I'm working with it myself, and I'm struggling to articulate necessarily what is the best way to kind of measure what comes across that. So how we achieve balance, and where is the balance? How much we. So what I'm trying to do is, like, I'm trying to do this with serviceability as another concept that is rather measurable, but of course you can work with public services a little bit better, in a way that you can kind of distribute them, or you can influence the distribution. But so, for example, public transport, and I mean, hospitals, schools, kindergartens. So when you start measuring that, like at least in Norway, we start feeling that there is a lot of balance. But of course, when we start kind of measuring the correlation with commercial services, things start to become much different, and you can start seeing much more disbalances occurring. And I think in that sense, my question is more about, what do you think is, what kind of measures we have to bring across the idea of spatial capital, the way you use density as accessibility metric and also in a spatial metric. So I'm pretty sure that you have worked with that. So I'm just curious to pose that question, like what kind of concepts you think should come on the other side to try to balance this more? Yeah.
Yes. Could you just a little bit the balance? You mean the balance between just briefly? So
intensity of development and like intensity of service or intensity of something else. That's what my question is more about. Like what could be else than service? Is there some other open space? So.
No, but first of all, of course, since I'm trying to push this idea of the spatial capital and very much stick to the physical dimension of the built dimension of the city, it can also be maybe a little bit exaggerated because it's not only the physical and the built dimension that is important. It's all of these things happening in cities where all these services or commercial activities are also influences, of course, how we use the city. So it's maybe in that sense exaggerating a little bit this physical spatial dimension in this analysis. And you're absolutely correct that normally we also look a lot about to other things, the urban life, dimensions of urban life, like services or commercial activity or whatever. So public services and commercial activities and so forth. And then, of course, but again, as you say, also emphasize that it's very much about the accessibility to these things, and the accessibility is to a large degree created by the spatial form. Of course, it can be further enhanced by public transport and so forth, but in principle, so I think there's a lot you can capture with these analysis, but it's still I want to. You're absolutely correct that it's kind of really the basic platform for a lot of other things. And of course, emphasizing that is because it's a thing that normally changes very, very slowly in a city. It's difficult to totally change this. So it's this, again, this kind of capital at the bottom that kind of creates basic potentials. But then, of course, you can do a lot on top of that. And that's maybe that's what you're saying, that we have to realize that too, and to bring that in and to balance the whole thing. We can't just create the perfect landscape and then leave it. But I totally agree with these things and how and again you can make so many super revealing analysis when you start to make these kind of analysis of the accessibility to different services or activities and so forth. And not least, I mean, from a social perspective, depending on where you live, what do you have access to within a reasonable distance, for instance? And of course, one would soon realize that it's very unevenly distributed, of course. And then it's nice when you can do it in this very detailed scale, because it can change within a very short distances, that the location over here is much more strong than in another one and so forth. Is that kind of what you asked, or is that any help?
Yeah, I guess it was not that clear, but it was in the same. But I was more thinking as well. Can you just to pose the spatial capital and social equity in a clear terms, or it's like what are the challenges you see there?
I could, it's a social equity. Yeah, I think that I mean, again, this is again maybe back to Alexander's question about when there's so many things we talk about without situating in its space. For instance, social equity. Okay, so normally you would look at people. Okay, so and then you would start to look at different groups, and certain groups have certain, they have certain incomes, they have certain degrees of education, they have whatever. There's a lot of things, and you start to talk about, but and then maybe we try to redistribute values in society through tax systems, and you bring, let's take some from the rich and give to the poor, right? But another way how things are distributed are in space, of course, that a lot of public and also private values, I don't find a word now, but are, of course, unevenly distributed. So even though we may, I may have some, I may get some money from the government to pay my rent. Okay, so we redistribute resources in society, but we also distribute them in space, right? So even though in certain places I have access to certain resources in society much less through space than in other locations, right? So certain locations you have everything, and in other locations you have very little. But that dimension we talk much less of. So I think it's a way of actually bringing another dimension to the discussion about social equity, where you could start to think that, okay, we distribute it often through money, redistributing money in society in different ways to create greater equity, maybe. But it is also, as soon as you make a public investment in a new school or whatever, it's also distributed, but distributed in space, right? So you need to think of that too. And this is something we actually have a lot of research on. We call it the distribution. It's an uneven distribution of life chances, in a sense, in a city where there's certain things you have access to and others not, depending on where you live.
Thank you.
Is that any help?
It is.
Thanks for your question, Todor.
So there is a last concluding comment from Peter Benushka. For you, it's a bit of a, I don't know, pop-up discussion. It usually happens around here. How do you approach the practical and maybe also theoretical dimension of the 15-minute city? How does it hold true in your understanding of urbanity?
No, but in principle, I find it a very, I mean, it's a good concept, but it's easily also misunderstood, I think. Well, of course, I think it's a reasonable idea that certain amenities and services and so forth should be reachable within 15 minutes. Now we're back to the Todor's question about social equity. I mean, it's kind of, are things distributed in a reasonable way? But it can be, I think it, it can be misinterpreted in the sense that it's only what you, because I mean, in the post-war era, in the 50s and 60s, when you built the large housing estates, I'm sure you did in Ukraine also, and so forth. It's a long, it's a long history. But then one created these kind of neighborhoods or housing estates, or where you had all the services actually within 15 minutes. I mean, that's what you did all over Sweden, for instance, and around the cities. But then you get certain things. At that time, you could get 2 food stores. You could you could even get the post office at these times and so forth, and a few other services. But the things beyond that, one never talked about. How do you get an opera house? So these 15-minute cities also need to be connected in a certain way, so they create a certain closeness to create other services of a bigger kind that may demand maybe a 30-minute city or something, or even more than that, to create these other services. So I find it a risk when we talk about the 15-minute city that we go back to that kind of neighborhood planning, the kind of isolated neighborhood planning, and try to fix all the services and amenities in each and every neighborhood. Because what you reach within 15 minutes, the size of that population can only carry the very basic things, right, in life. Whereas the larger things that we look for in a city, let's say an opera house, or let's say an Apple store or whatever, you need to make a lot of 15-minute cities work together. And this is how cities always have worked. So you have the neighborhood, but it's connected to other neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods together create a district, and these districts are connected to each other. So you create a big city. And on each level, you create the opportunity for services, both public services, but also commercial activities that you may that may be useful for everyday life. Or and then, are you following me? So it's kind of, because when we distribute, if we cut the city up into 20, 15-minute cities, you lose this other quality. And that's what we did in the 50s and 60s, I think, in the modernistic planning, and forgot about how things need also to build this bigger thing. But fundamentally, I totally agree that one should have that kind of, I mean, there's certain basic things, and areas that don't have these things within 15 minutes, then we're back to an uneven distribution and social inequity. Yeah.
I've been trying to tie down several things at once, and thank you. I think everybody is quite happy with getting a quite in-depth answers to their questions. Let's say we will be concluding slowly this beautiful presentation of the book, which I highly recommend everybody to read. And again, it can serve indeed as a guide to urban planners and urban designers to getting up to speed in their profession in a way about how to talk about things in the way we should be talking about them in 2025. But I have some concluding, allow me. So one of the contributions that has recently been published is a book called Territorial Urbanism Now. And they have brought something that you've mentioned also throughout the book and in your presentation, and about how do we value unbuilt environment. And I think they have been trying to find a way. And I think this is a problem that we should be theoretically tackling a lot more right now, is about how do we work. We haven't been able, as I say, it's just 2016, 2017, where we started to have a comprehensive picture of the urban land rent, of the urban land economics. This is where planners got a clear clarity of the message about the economic system, where we've been working due to very basic land markets and housing market. But now we are trying to switch on to the next dimension of this understanding. And just a quote from this book. It's not very long, but I think it gives certain type of idea. But what does it mean for the built environment if it is no longer a structuring element? It can become subordinate to the continuity resulting from the ecological logic of the territory. Developing the urban, therefore, no longer means building growth, but rather improving the quality of the space between the city's existing stock of buildings. And I think this is one of the ideas, perhaps, which can be followed up in, let's say, research and discussions that we can have in the future. But I'm otherwise very thankful for your contribution and for all the participants for raising their own questions. And I think I will be concluding this. If you have maybe some concluding words from your side as well, Lars.
No, yeah, that sounds like a very interesting book. Please send it over, and I will send you the link on my book if one wants to download from the open access and so forth. But more importantly, I really want to thank you for this invitation and the very, very good questions. I haven't made so many presentations of this book, so this was a good opportunity, and I really appreciate these good questions. So it's very, very, it was a special occasion for me to do this, and I hope we can stay in touch. I would find that very interesting.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you as well. The recording will be available at the YouTube of the Kharkiv School of Architecture, maybe other week. But otherwise, thank you all, and please download and read the book. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lars.
Thank you, Ryan.